Well, hi, and welcome back to Risk Management. Today we're covering part 3 of risk communication, where we'll be talking about stigma, bliss, and probability neglect. That is, the idea that we overlook the likelihood of a risk actually occurring if we have high stigma towards that risk, or if we have high bliss towards a certain benefit. And so we see again that affect really matters in terms of how people either take into account or discount a risk as a result of their affect for that risk. We'll start by talking about probability neglect, and then we'll move on in the final installment of risk communication to talking about how affect can actually be changed or shaped in order to create perceptions of risk or to create misperceptions of risk. So let's get started. We all know that when there's excitement about something that we somehow jump to conclusions that actually are a bit irrational. Take, for example, lotteries. When there's a massive jackpot, it powers what's called a mania. And here's an example of a newspaper article where the person says, I could quit my job. This is wonderful. I can take off for the rest of my life. And people are lining up and trying to get their tickets before the last ticket is dropped. Of course, the odds are so minuscule that this is simply a waste of funds. But that doesn't stop people from being crazed and jumping in line to buy many, many tickets when this occurs. There is, in other words, a neglect of the probability of winning when there's excitement about the possibility of winning. And we see that also when it comes to risks or to other sorts of benefits. Here's an example from an election where people in the Kerry Edwards election against George W. Bush were actually jumping on airplanes if they were expatriates, flying home to the United States at their own expense. Rather than cast an absentee ballot, they wanted to make sure that their local ballot would be counted. And so they would actually fly to the US simply for purposes of voting. Here again, we know that the odds that your vote will actually count to tip an election are virtually zero in a presidential sort of election. And yet, people acting irrationally do so because there's so much they believe at stake that they discount what their possible effect on that outcome can be. This is not surprising. People have studied this effect under laboratory conditions. Chris Shea at the University of Chicago with a colleague did a study where they looked at two different sorts of probabilities. The probability of winning a certain amount of money and the probability of getting an electric shock. And so in the one case where you were fined up to $20 for taking part in the study, there was a probability between 1 and 99% of receiving a $20 fine. And then there was also a probability between 1 and 99% of receiving an electric shock. What's interesting is that there's actually a very linear steep curve, and you can see that here for the money curve, in terms of people's willingness to pay something in order to not lose $20. And so it goes from virtually zero when it's a 1% chance of losing $20, all the way up to about $18 to $19 when there's a 99% chance of losing $20. That's sort of a normal linear curve that you might expect. What's interesting is that the curve for an electric shock is virtually unchanged. That is, even if the shock is virtually unlikely to occur, 1%, people are about as willing to pay for that to avoid that shock as they are if the shock's 99% likely to occur. In other words, the amount I'm willing to pay to avoid the electric shock really doesn't matter how likely the electric shock is. Our affect is triggered. When we hear electric shock, we're scared, we're alarmed, in a way that losing $20 doesn't alarm us and scare us. And therefore, people's willingness to pay is basically impervious or insensitive to the likelihood of the shock. Whereas for money, people are cued in more on the probability of losing money in terms of deciding how much to pay. So we see again here that strong affect will overcome probabilities. This also occurs when we're talking about things like cancer and exposures to cancers. For example, the public, if you look at these two curves here, Slovic and a couple of other people did a study where they looked at both public people and expert toxicologists and asked them about if somebody has a cancer risk as a result of either receiving a low or a high exposure to a certain chemical. And toxicologists actually are a little bit more informed about this, and therefore their curve looks a little bit more like the money curve. They recognize that if there's low exposure to a chemical, there is low risk of cancer, whereas if there's high exposure to the chemical, there's higher risk of cancer. The public doesn't actually notice that as well. You can see their curve is much flatter here, meaning that if you simply say there's a chemical to which I've been exposed that produces cancer, it doesn't matter how much of the chemical you were exposed to. For these people who are in the public, the very fact that it can cause cancer is enough to cause a recognition of cancer risk where the toxicologist would not consider it to be such. Also, the risk of cancer is estimated to be higher overall for the public than for toxicologists who downplay the risk of chemicals. So education, training, experience, and judgment can dampen the affect that people have when they're uninformed about it. When they're uninformed, their fear tends to be higher, and therefore they tend to overestimate risks. This is something that Slovic also found, however, even for toxicologists, to be the case that affect plays a role. Toxicologists who were experts were asked to make a quick intuitive rating for each of 30 chemical items, such as benzene, aspirin, secondhand cigarette smoke, dioxin, and food, on an affect scale of bad to good. Next, they were asked to judge the degree of risk associated with a very small exposure to the chemical, defined as an exposure that is less than 1/100th the exposure level that would begin to be cause of concern for a regulatory agency. In other words, they said, rate this chemical in terms of how deadly you think it is, how bad or good a chemical it is. And then also judge the degree of risk associated when there's a very low dose of this chemical given, so low that it's 1/100th of what the EPA or another regulatory agency would consider safe. What's interesting is that Slovic found, even among expert toxicologists, that affect matters very significantly when judging the risk of a very small exposure. And almost every single correspondent in his study, 95 out of 97, showed a negative correlation, that when the affect was positive, risk was very small, and that when affect was negative and there was strong stigma to the chemical, the judgment of risk was very high. In other words, people reacted to things that they felt negatively about and overestimated risks, and those things that they felt positively about, they underestimated risks. And this was true even for experts. So Cass Sunstein, a law professor at Harvard, has talked about this when he talks about terrorism and probability neglect. And he says people are prone to probability neglect, especially when their emotions are intensely engaged. Probability neglect is highly likely in the aftermath of terrorism. People fall victim to probability neglect, and to the extent that the intensity of their reaction does not greatly vary, even with large differences in the likelihood of harm. Think back to our risk screening lectures where we talked about how important it is to take into account the prevalence of the risk in determining whether to screen for it. Here what we see is that most people will totally disregard the prevalence of the risk if they have a lot of negative affect or stigma towards that risk. And so when probability neglect is at work, people's attention is focused on the bad outcome itself, and they are inattentive to the fact that it is unlikely to occur. For example, in the context of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, public fear led to private and public costs that were orders of magnitude higher than the cost of the attacks themselves, and that is best explained in part by reference to probability neglect. The same might be said about extraordinary public fear produced by the sniper attacks in the Washington, D.C. area in October of 2002. The extent of the fear is hard to understand without an appreciation of probability neglect. Fear, whether rational or not, says Sunstein, is itself a cost, and is likely to lead to a range of other costs in the form of countless ripple effects. If government is able to reduce the level of fear produced by probability neglect, it should do so. In other words, what Sunstein is saying is we need to be effective risk communicators, because if we're overstating risk, fear itself can have consequences for society, particularly misperceived fears or overestimated fears. And so risk perceptions lead to stigma, and stigma leads to economic losses. And we can see these in a variety of contexts. Many companies have almost been bankrupted as a result of overestimated fears to their products. Perrier almost lost $80 million and went bankrupt as a result of benzene contamination allegations in its water. Alar Apples, Washington State apple growers lost $100 million in crop due to pesticide spraying that was considered innocuous. Tylenol lost $1.4 billion due to tampering that was actually only in one store by one or two individuals. And 3 Mile Island caused people to be panicked about nuclear power, and there was over $10 billion in losses from the energy sector as a result. So we see that fear and stigmatization can have very strong consequences. hazardous or mixed wastes, electronic transmission lines like EMF, or bioengineered fruits, milk, or vegetables are next on the agenda for fear. And we hear all about fears every day in the media, and it has huge consequences for the economy, for safety, and for livelihoods when people are overly fearful. So the implications of affect and stigma is that prevention is important. When people are stigmatized, they want to absolutely block the risk, shut it down, eliminate it, not just mitigate it, even if the cost is extremely high. There's a wonderful paper by Tammy Tangs called 500 Life-Saving Interventions, where she goes through and estimates the cost benefit of each of 500 different regulatory fixes or regulatory attempts to mitigate risk. And some of them create such astronomically high costs per statistical year of life saved that it's simply insensible that we're doing it. And yet, because of stigma, because of affect, we do. So I want to talk also about affect in the circumstances of uncertainty, where people don't know how to judge whether there's a risk or not. We've talked a lot about affect and how it influences risk, but what about affect when we don't know whether to judge something as good or bad? Chris Shea at the University of Chicago has studied this, and he says to say that an attribute is hard to evaluate means that people don't know whether a given value on the attribute is good or bad. In other words, they're unsure what sort of affect to place when given something. He studied things like, for example, taking two different dictionaries, and he had a dictionary A and a dictionary B. Dictionary A had 10,000 entries in it. It also had no defects. It was a perfectly brand new dictionary. And then dictionary B had 20,000 entries in it, double the number of entries of dictionary A, but it had a torn cover. Otherwise, it was brand new. And then he asked people to rate how they liked these dictionaries. If he presented the dictionaries together, the overwhelming majority of respondents preferred dictionary B, the one with more words in it. But if you presented the dictionaries separately, more people liked dictionary A than dictionary B. Why? Because they had nothing to compare dictionary A and B to, other than the fact that dictionary B had a torn cover. And therefore, they presupposed that it was an inferior dictionary to dictionary A, even though it was not. And so what we see here is that comparison, or the ability to judge things in a framing or context, helps to remove uncertainty and helps people to gain affect and therefore to make judgments about risk. We see this also, for example, in asking people whether to accept a certain gamble. On a scale rating of 0 to 20, people were asked to rate the attractiveness of two different gambles. In the first scenario, people were told they had a 7 in 36 chance to win $9, otherwise they would win nothing. They rated that a 9.4 on the mean attractiveness scale. In gamble 2, people were told they had a 7 in 36 chance to win $9, but they had a 29 in 36 chance to lose 5 cents. Those people, interestingly enough, even though they were going to potentially lose more than the first gamble, preferred it highly over the first gamble. Now, rationally speaking, that's incorrect. We should prefer gamble 1, because you don't lose anything if you don't win. Whereas in gamble 2, if you lose, you actually lose something. And yet, the payoff in number 1 is not something we can evaluate. Is $9 good or bad? We have no affect to inform us, and therefore we're kind of neutral to whether it's good or not. But once we know that we have possibilities of winning huge and losing only a little, we are much more comfortable with it, even if overall it's not as good a bet as the first one. So the $9 comes alive with feeling as a very attractive outcome compared to a small loss. And that weight, that contextual judgment, and that affect helps us to judge it a better outcome. This is also found in Uncertainty in Finance that Gonzach in 2001 did a study where he found that if stocks were perceived as good stocks, they were judged to have high return and low risk. If they were perceived as bad stocks, companies that we think are doing evil in the world, they were judged to be low in return and high in risk. And what's interesting, though, is for familiar stocks, those where we really know the company itself intimately and we follow what the company's trends are and its products and so forth, the inverse relationship between risk and reward was offset, and instead there was a positive correlation where risk and return were positively correlated. So that's typically the case, is that high risk tends to carry high reward, but because of people's affects, people think high risk has low reward and low risk has high reward. So it actually offsets in our minds because of our affect, and we do the incorrect thing in terms of judging the potential benefits that go along with a risk in finance. So then the next question that comes up is, well, if affect can screw up our minds in thinking about risk, how do we get rid of stigma, downplay misperceived or false fears so that people don't overestimate risks or underestimate benefits? Because after all, risk and benefit are often positively correlated. If I take on high risk activities, I may also get high benefits. Whereas if I get low risk activities, I may be in people's minds, it's the reverse of this going on. If they have this is the normal true fact is that high risk leads to high benefit. In most people's minds, high risk has low benefit and high benefit has low risk, which is just not the case in reality, but our affects make it so. So when we talk about things, if we use different words to refer to the same thing, we can see that people's judgment of the benefit and the risk really depends on context. If I talk about nuclear power, for example, people find that the benefit is low and the risk is high. But if I talk about getting x-rays and dental workups, people find high benefits and low risk. In other words, the affect makes these negative or inversely related to each other. X-rays and nuclear power are both emitting radiation that can potentially harm us, but simply by talking about x-rays in a context of dental work, where we understand there might be some benefit, and we think about nuclear power only in terms of meltdowns, then of course people, although they're referring basically to the same thing, don't perceive the risks in the same way. Same goes with pesticides and prescription drugs. Both are chemicals and both have potential side effects. Pesticides are often considered to have low benefit and high risk, whereas prescription drugs are often seen to have high benefit and low risk. Again, it's merely the name slapped on it and the affect that we give to it that determines whether there's a higher benefit or a lower risk or vice versa with returns on specific types of exposures to risks. The strength of the inverse negative relationship to risk and benefit judgment for a particular hazard, for example, nuclear power, depends on the degree of affect. That is, how strongly stigmatized the risk is or how strong the benefit is in our mind. There are some ways in which our affect kicks in even stronger than normally. One of those is when we're under time pressure. Time pressure reduces our opportunity to think rationally and deliberately and increases reliance on affect. Under time pressure, people are more likely to use affect heuristics than judgments. And so therefore, we'll end up with more skews, more false risks, and more misperceived risks when we're under time pressure. So we need to try to remove time pressure if we're going to try to estimate risk correctly. Another way to try to manipulate affect is to provide both risk and benefit information. If I can provide information that there's a benefit that is high to using some product or service, then people infer there's a lower risk with it. So one way to offset the fear of something is to emphasize the good things about that. Nuclear power does carry risks of meltdown and potential radiation exposure, but it also means that your electricity bill will be lower, that you also don't have as much carbon emission into the atmosphere and therefore climate change is reduced, and that it's less costly overall for your electrical bill. So you can think of ways of doing this such that we could downplay the fear of nuclear energy and actually potentially use it. So here's another graph that shows this, where we can emphasize the positive, either saying the benefit is high and therefore the risk is low, as in part A, or in part B, we say the risk is low and therefore people will infer the benefit to be high. Or we could say the benefit is low, but then the risk is inferred to be high. That is, if we want to scare people about nuclear power. Or if we say the risk is high, then people will see the benefit of it as being low. So again, these are just two sides of the same coin. If we want to get a positive risk perception and have people think that the risk is manageable, then we should emphasize the positive benefits and the low risks. If we want to create stigma about this particular thing, then we need to emphasize low benefits and high risks. This happens also in framing, for example, with surgery versus radiation therapy. If I talk about mortality rates for surgery and radiation, such as in column 1 here, and I have 10% treatment success or 10% mortality for surgery, 0% for radiation, people's choice of radiation therapy is 44%. Whereas if I talk about survival rates, even though radiation has a 100% survival rate and surgery only 90%, people tend to favor surgery over radiation when I talk about survival rates. So again, How we frame the discussion, talking about either the mortality rates of surgery and radiation or the survival rates of surgery and radiation, will affect people's choices in whether they choose surgery or radiation as a treatment. So how do we eliminate stigma? One of the things that's very important for that is to keep trust. If you don't have the public's trust, no matter what their perceptions are, you simply cannot earn further ability to communicate risks to them. You have lost the ability, and there's a wall that is shut down between you and them such that they are impervious to future stigmatization or removal of stigma regarding a certain risk. As C. Starr once said, acceptance of any risk is more dependent on public confidence in risk management than on quantitative estimates of risk. It's not so much the actual calculations about risk, but how you're managing it and how you're handling that risk that really counts with the public. Trust is key. If you have trust, the path will be smooth and you can change people's perceptions of risk accordingly. If you do not have trust of the public, no matter what your phrasing or what your presentation, you are unlikely to be successful in risk management. Abraham Lincoln said that if you once forfeit the confidence of your fellow citizens, you can never regain their respect and esteem. Trust is an asymmetric principle. It's far easier to destroy it than to create it. Negative events outweigh positive events, so if you destroy trust, it's harder to earn it back. Negative events are more sharply defined. Your lies or the accidents that you have are things that stick out in people's minds more than the positive things you did. Positive events are often fuzzy or indistinct, and so people can't quite remember the benefits that you emphasized. The media knows that sources of bad news are more credible than sources of good news, so it's hard to offset bad news. And finally, risk is easier to demonstrate than the absence of risk. The system itself tends to destroy risk trust. Powerful news media is always trying to overestimate risks, and unfortunately, it deadens the population to effective risk communication. An adversarial risk management system with litigation in courts likewise does that. The rise of special interest groups trying to get certain outcomes has skewed risk perceptions. And the proliferation of risk assessment studies, many of which are of shoddy quality, as we've seen throughout this class, have also deadened the confidence of the public to science and scientific research into risk. At the end of the day, the fact that there are subtle differences in how risk characterizations are framed can have such marked effects suggests that those responsible for the presentation of risk information have considerable ability to manipulate perceptions and behaviors. This raises ethical and procedural problems that must be recognized and addressed. And that's what I want to leave you with. If you are in risk management, you are also going to be in the business of risk communication. And that means you need to be honest, transparent, and ethical in how you communicate risks. You need to estimate the risks carefully. If there are uncertainties, you need to admit them as such, and you need not to try to skew people's perceptions, understanding that people are driven often by affect and not by cognitive or system 2 thinking about risk. So we've talked about a lot here today, but in summary, the emphasis is again that people's risk communication perceptions are based largely on affect, that affect is manipulable, but that when we lose people's trust, we lose our ability to risk communicate and therefore our ability to manage risk. Okay, we're done for today. I look forward to seeing you in a future class, and I'll see you on the chat boards.